All right, so good afternoon. My name is Italo Lins Lemos. I'm one of the members of the organizing committee of the first International Colloquium in Philosophy Studies at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. And I would like to welcome all of you to this session on logic and epistemology. I remind you that the questions may be asked to the speakers by the end of the session via the YouTube chat, but don't forget to identify yourself and to say to whom you are addressing the question. The attendance list on Google Forms will be available soon in the YouTube chat. And I also remind you that each speaker will be entitled to 15 minutes to present their work. And by the end of the session, the general public may raise questions. Well, without further ado, the first speaker is Roberto Schmitz-Nietzsche, who is a PhD student in philosophy at the Federal University of Santa Maria. His presentation is entitled Life on Venus, an analysis of the functioning of thought experiments. So Roberto, thank you for coming, and the microphone is all yours.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk about life on Venus. So the first slide may come in. Let's begin then. Life on Venus, an analysis of the functioning of thought experiments according to the argument approach. We could imagine that one of the main search points for extraterrestrial life are the exoplanets discovered orbiting stars colossally distant from our solar system. However, we found a possible proof of life outside the Earth in our own planetary neighborhood. Recent studies sought to point out that phosphine, phosphorus hydrate pH 3, can be considered a biomarker. That is, when found in some environment, it can indicate the presence of life. Coincidentally, another recent study demonstrated the presence of pH 3 in the clouds of Venus' atmosphere. That first study pointed out the conditions for phosphine to be considered a biomarker on a hypothetical planet, while the second brought the hypothetical planet to reality. John Norton's approach on thought experiments. One of the most influential explanations of how thought experiments work was proposed by John Norton in 1991. The author proposes that thought experiments are arguments which posit hypothetical or counterfactual states of affairs and invoke particulars irrelevant to the generality of the conclusion. My proposal is that a thought experiment can be created within the framework of Norton's approach for the imaginary scenarios described by the work of Souza Silva. So, imagine a hypothetical rocky planet with characteristics similar of those of Earth in size, temperature, and pressure. Through spectroscopy analysis, the presence of phosphine on this planet, a gas linked to the presence of life, has been identified by previous studies. As there is no explanation of chemical processes that are able to produce phosphine in a significant amount that could be detected, such as through lightning, radiation, and volcanism, it could be assumed that it could be explained by the presence of life on this planet. I believe that the proposed conditions for a case to be classified as a thought experiment are satisfied. We have a hypothetical scenario, or counterfactual, depending on what we adopt as a definition of these terms, of a state of affairs. There are irrelevant particulars. We can establish that it was another process and not the spectroscopy that found phosphine, or that another biomarker gas, such as oxygen, was found instead of phosphine, and clearly we are facing a group of arguments. Norton also argues that the current conduct of a thought experiment consists of the execution of an argument, although this may not be obvious since the argument may appear only in abbreviated form and with suppressed premises. If the arguments contained in the thought experiment can be identified, then all thought experiments can be reconstructed as arguments based on tacit or explicit assumptions. Our next step is to seek to rebuild the life on Venus case. Assumption 1. Spectroscopy is reliable. Assumption 2. Phosphine is a possible biomarker on rocky planets. Assumption 3. Significant amounts of phosphine cannot be produced by processes such as lightning, solar radiation, volcanic activity, and meteoritic delivery. From 1, 2, and 3, If we find a rocky planet that presents phosphine through spectroscopy analysis, then there are indications of biological activities on that planet. This is just one of the many possible configurations to reconstruct the life on Venus case in arguments. Each of the premises can be questioned to some extent. In the first premise, we need to accept the reliability of spectroscopy, which has broad, if not total, acceptance by the scientific community. However, being able to identify gases on extremely distant planets is not an easy task. Greaves point out the various difficulties faced with being able to observe phosphine in one of the very closest planets to ours. So, even if the method is reliable, the data produced by it is not necessarily reliable. The second premise also appears to be problematic. The complete phosphine cycle is not completely known, which leaves room for the possibility of some chemical process capable of producing phosphine that is not yet known, as pointed out by Greaves. If no known chemical process can explain pH 3 within the upper atmosphere of Venus, then it must be produced by a process not previously considered plausible for Venusian conditions. This could be unknown photochemistry or geochemistry, which also brings problems to premise 3. Conclusion 4 depends on the acceptance of the previous premises. Here it must be evident that we are dealing with an inductive process and not a deductive process. That is, the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. We will see below that this detail can bring serious problems to John Norton's approach, since the author argues that belief in the outcome conclusion of the thought experiment is justified only insofar as the reconstructed argument can justify the conclusion. Thus, the reconstructed version of the thought experiment must undergo an analysis of the rules of logic to verify whether the conclusion follows from the premises. So, what Norton's approach misses? Are we able to reconstruct thought experiments into arguments? Norton makes it clear that the argument may appear only in abbreviated form and with suppressed premises. This certainly leads us to question whether his approach does not produce a great demand for thought experimenters. It does not seem to be the case that the subjects in general have knowledge of logic and that they know how to identify arguments to then apply the rules of logic. If the justification and reliability in the results of thought experiments depend only on this point, that is, on the subject's ability to know how to apply logical rules to hypothetical scenarios, then it is very likely that the subjects are hardly really justified in believing in the results achieved through the execution of thought experiments. Leaving this problem aside, suppose that the subjects know how to identify arguments in the midst of descriptions of hypothetical scenarios, how to reconstruct them in logical formulas, and how to apply the logical rules correctly. Then it comes to logical rules. It seems reasonable to think that Norton is referring to rules for negation, for conditionals, for conjunctions, for disjunctions, for biconditionals, etc. But what can we say about these rules? Do they really generate justification and reliability? Deductive processes seem to fit properly with what Norton requires. The traditional definition of deductive argument says that it is impossible for the conclusion derived from the premises to be false if the premises are true. Just remember the classic example. Socrates is a man, men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Thus, we can see that the conclusion is not a deductive process necessarily follow from the premises. There is no other possibility. If it does not necessarily follow, the deductive process did not work correctly. If it occurs properly, then there seems to be no problem in stating that we are justified in believing the conclusion. But this is not the case with inductive processes. In these cases, the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. The result of the life on Venus case does not necessarily follow from the premises used as evidence for the conclusion. Inductive processes deal with probabilities and analogies. Thus, inductive arguments are invalid because, unlike deductions, we do not have logical rules for their assessment. Therefore, the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. Only with the use of logical rules we cannot make the assessment of inductive cases, like the life on Venus case. That is, Norton's approach fails to make us have justification and confidence in the results of argumentation processes by induction. And it seems that this is precisely the type of argument most used by scientists. Leaving aside logical problems, assuming that it is possible to get around them, there is yet another problem for the basis of the premises. How to trust the truth of the premises? Norton declares himself an empiricist, that is, knowledge comes from experience. But he says that justification comes from rational processes, which is quite strange. The assessment of the veracity of premises that contain mathematical and geometrical statements is easy to evaluate, since 2 plus 2 can only be 4 and a square can only have 4 sides. But this is not the case with assumptions about the world, which certainly are the most used by scientists. As an example, just look at the arguments contained in the two studies presented above. We know, since the time of Hume, that we should not expect that natural events will necessarily repeat. It is only our habit of seeing things happen in a certain way that leads us to infer that they will happen in the same way in the future. But this does not imply the necessity for the repetition of the event. This makes thought experiments, especially in sciences, quite problematic, since it is often only assumed that things are a certain way to test their implications. So, in conclusion, I hope to have demonstrated that the argument approach developed by John Norton presents several problems for its acceptance. First, it is difficult to accept the idea that subjects, in general, are able to find the premises hidden and suppressed in thought experiments, and that they are still able to apply logical rules for their evaluation. In cases where inductive processes occur, as in the example of life on Venus, there are no logical rules that justify us to believe in the results of thought experiments. On the other side, even in deductive cases, which do not seem to be the majority, where there are rules for the assessment of the premises and which justify us to believe in the results of the thought experiment, we cannot be fully justified because the empirical content of the premises cannot be attested through the analysis of logical rules. So that's pretty much it. Thank you all.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Roberto. The next presentation is going to be delivered by Iago Melo Batistella, who is a PhD student in philosophy at the State University of Campinas. His presentation is entitled Assertion, Fiction Making, and Fictional Information. Iago, thank you for coming, and the microphone is open.
Hello, everyone. So I will first outline what I want to do, and then I go through the argument. And there will probably be some question that goes unanswered, but I had to make some cuts because 15 minutes is not too much. So let's start. First, the outline of this is the title page. Now the outline, you can pode passar, Gustavo. This is the outline of my presentation. I will present the following topics. First, I will state what it is to take fiction making as a speech act. We'll talk about fiction and speech acts, and assertions and lying, things like that. And then I will present two views on fiction and assertions, which is the patchwork approaches and the dual act approaches. And I will present my argument against assertion in fiction, and I will present some considerations on factual information and the relation to assertion in fictional works. I'm just going to talk about fiction, not about assertions in general. What I will not do, I will not propose a definition of fiction. I will not debate the existence of fictional objects. I will not discuss the aesthetic merits of this or that work. So I will not discuss if something is fictional or not fictional. I will not discuss corner cases. I will not discuss new journalism, things like that. So next slide, stuff. Okay. First, speech X theories of fiction often characterize fiction as an act, as part of an act of fiction making. And fiction making is a sui generis illocutionary force. This speech act of fiction making is constructed as an expression of the intention to raise a certain imaginative endeavor in the reader of a fictional work. So it's constructed as Grice intended to construct speech acts, not as it's intentional, not conventional, and in relation to the content of what was written or said in the performance of the act. So here's how it works. Take a sentence S to be the sentence of a fictional work, and P to be the content of that utterance or expressed by an utterance of that sentence. So in the process of writing a work of fiction, the author of S of that sentence expresses that P, and he expresses the intention that the reader imagines that P. So that's broadly a broad characterization of fiction as a speech act. So that is, the author of assertion fiction intends that the reader of that work, in face of certain utterances, grasp the content of what was said, and assumes a certain propositional attitude, that is imagination or make-believe or whatever you want. I'm not going to go into further details about it. That's what I said. You have to imagine what was said, not believe it. That's the difference from assertion. So there are two views on assertion in fiction. First, most works of fiction seem to be composed not only of acts of fiction making, but also of assertions. And this is widely accepted. Like Searle and Curry disagree on everything, but they agree on this point. So the following examples are, I'm going to be creative, so I'm going to use the usual example of this debate. So when Tolstoy writes in Anna Karenina, happy families are all alike, unhappy families are unhappy in its own way, he's asserting it. But when he writes that everything was confusion in the Oblonsky's house, he was fiction making. You have to imagine two, but you have to believe one. So there are two approaches to it, patchwork approaches, which take assertion and fiction making to be completely separate, and dual act approaches, which take assertion and make believe can be made in the same utterance. You can utter, like Tolstoy can utter chew, and when he utters chew, he does both things at the same time. The slides are going okay. We are in slide 5. Okay. And dual act approaches are based on Bach and Neo accounts of dual speech acts, which is independently motivated theory. I'm not gonna deal with this too much because we don't have too much time. So what I'm gonna do, next slide, Gustav, please. I don't know if, so I'm gonna, on statements like two friends write this. The statement meets our requirements, standard requirements to a sincere assertion. So denying that is an assertion is just begging the question. Well, I will deny that they are assertions. And I take that while sincere assertions could be part of a work of fiction, it's common sense to consider that works of fiction are free of insincere assertion or lies. So without my argument goes that without direct access to the author's beliefs, it is impossible to determine if an assertion is sincere or insincere. So the reader can never successfully infer the communicative intention of the author. So he can never identify the illocutionary force. And I think this should be enough ground to deny that there are assertions in fiction. So next slide, my argument goes as follows. I take S to be a so-called assertion in a fictional work. So a statement of S is successful only if it's a sincere assertion. And without direct access to the author's belief, we can never know if S is a sincere assertion. So if the author's intention, it's never overt. If the author's intention are never overt in relation to an utterance of S, so when a statement of S is never a successful assertion. That's the overall structure. And now I'm gonna present some points. I'm gonna justify some of the premises and things like that. So premise 1 is anchored in the common sense intuition that there are no lies in works of fiction. So as a background of this premise, I assume the following definition of lying. An individual lies to another individual if there is a proposition P and such that A asserts P to B and A believes that P is false. So lies are just insincere assertions or assertion of disbelieved information. That's broadly accepted, like everyone's accept this. Like there's a footnote there, which is like a list of 8 or 10 examples of people who accept this. So I take insincere assertions are, as characterized here, are just assertion of disbelief information. Common sense dictates, but not only common sense, you can see in Meyer, that I'm not going to dwell here, that if a piece of information conveyed by an author of fiction is false or disbelieved by the author should not be taken in the work of fiction as lying, as matters of true falsity, and if the information is part of the author's belief, should not interfere with the construction of the fictional world. The point is that, distinct from most inquirers, false information provided by works of fiction should not be taken as misrepresenting the world. So it's not a lie. It is a construction of a set of fictional truths. It's a construction of the fictional world. So this kind of information in fiction is not to be believed, but to be imagined. Next slide. So we may characterize, taking this, we may characterize an assertion in a work of fiction as follows. Take S to be a sentence and P to be the content expressed by an utterance of X. S. In the process of writing the work of fiction, the author of S expresses the belief that P, this is an assertion. And the intention that the reader believes that P, and as there are no insincere assertion in fiction, it also, for it to be an assertion, the utterance the content of P has to be believed by the author. That's the point. There are no insincere assertions in fiction. So my point is that without direct access to the author's belief, we may never know if their speech act is sincere, if the assertion is sincere or insincere. This is not a problem to fiction, apart from very specific cases like trivial assertion or bald-faced lies. We cannot never be secure of the sincerity of someone else's speech act. So the point is that there is nothing in the oral linguistic practices that guarantees that a speech act is sincere. Sincerity is something that we assume to achieve a greater communicative goal. But this is next slide. This uncertainty is not a problem to day-to-day conversation, as performing and recognizing an assertion is the same process, be the assertion sincere or insincere, but this uncertainty is a problem for speech act theories of fiction, as performing and recognizing a sincere assertion is a quite distinct process from performing and recognizing an act of fiction making. One involves beliefs, other involves imagination. So accordingly, every candidate assertion put forward by an author of a work of fiction would require a guess by the reader. The reader will have to guess if this assertion is fiction making or assertion, or if it's communication of belief or to something to be imagined. So the reader can never be sure if he's recognizing the right intention communicated by the author. So the intention to raise belief, I think, is not overt, as it's not clear if it's always the case. It's not clear if the author always wants to raise belief. It's not overt in this sense. So an overtness of intention is an important part of performing and recognizing a speech act. A successful speech act is one which the uptake occurs in according to the speaker's intention. So for this to be possible, now I'm sitting green, the agent in question, the speaker, must not only make her intention to undertake certain commitment manifest, she must intend that this very intention should be manifest. It has to be overt. So the audience shouldn't guess the intention of the speaker. The intention has to be made overt so that the audience can recognize. The audience should not guess the speech act you're doing. She has to recognize the speech act you're doing. So that's the whole point. I take it as there are never overt assertions. There can never be a successful assertion. That's my whole argument. So my point is that I do not deny the initial intuition behind a defense that Friend proposed, that are assertions in fiction. In some utterances, I take that they do in fact check most boxes, not all, for sincere assertions. Some authors express beliefs in works of fiction. Those beliefs are believed by the readers, just like in regular assertion. But my point is that the process of recognizing this communicative intention, the intention of doing an assertion, can never be taken as secure. If something of the sort, as recognizing the intention to do an assertion happens, it happens by accident. Assertions in fictional works can at best be unsuccessful. And the recognition of an assertion of such speech act can be at best a shot in the dark. So back to sentence one, when Tolstoy said something like one, we can never be sure if he actually believed one. We can guess, we can imagine that we can take him as he did, we can take that he's writing a justification for the fact that he did, but we can never be sure about it. And this is a problem, because if we can never be sure about the speech act was not overt, and if it was not overt, it was not successful. We can guess that that what he proposed in one by what he proposed. We can guess by the imagery that he presented in his writing that he actually asserted, but we can never be sure. He could, however, be just painting an image or setting a tone for his novel. So even if he wants us to believe in one, if he didn't want us to believe in one, he wants us to take one as part of the story. So I take that sentences like one are, in fact, acts of fiction making. That's all. See you all at the bar next year, I hope. So that's it.
All right. Thank you very much, Iago. Well, the attendance list on Google Forms is available in the YouTube chat, right? And by the end of the session, the speakers are going to answer the questions raised by the public, but you guys can raise the questions by now on the chat on YouTube, and later on, I'm going to read them to the speakers. Anyway, the final presentation is going to be delivered by Gary Hadfield, who is an Adam Seibert Professor in Moral and Intellectual Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. His presentation is entitled Gibson and the Geometric Layout, Not Ecological Enough. And Professor Hadfield, it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be back in Brazil, if only virtually. And this paper follows up on a paper that I gave at the Principia conference a couple of years ago, and develops that line of work. So slide. So that's the title of my paper. If we directly perceive the world, what properties should it appear to have? Slide. Presumably, the very properties that it does have. But railway tracks appear to converge phenomenally into the distance. And so we have a photograph here, but I'm asking you to imagine that you're actually on railroad tracks and you're looking out there and they are going away into the distance from you phenomenally. Is this appearance a misperception? I think not. It is a way of presenting spatial structure to an organism. But the celebrated ecological psychologist James Gibson disagreed. I will attempt to say why. I regard the phenomenal convergence as the manifestation of a more general attribute of visual spatial perception. Slide. The contraction, we should have a slide here. Next slide. Yeah, there it is. The contraction of visual space in the in-depth dimension along egocentric lines of sight or visual directions. The phenomenal convergence is not a mistake caused by inadequate information about distance. Rather, it is a phenomenal accommodation to the decrease in information with distance. Slide. So I have 5 points to make. That the phenomenal convergence of the tracks does not result from the painter's attitude of experiencing in linear perspective. That phenomenal convergence is not required by optics. That Gibson denied phenomenal convergence. That his understanding of available phenomenologies and his physicalist objectivism led him astray. And that phenomenal convergence might be a good thing, retaining many Gibson-like relational properties of size and distance. So the first section is phenomenologies of convergence. The contracted space that I mentioned is a third phenomenal alternative, lying between full phenomenal constancy and a 2D perspective image, which I take to be flat. It describes a contraction as things run away in depth and differs from a perspective image. Slide. Consider this perspective rendering of a hallway. In the image, the angle between the door jamb and the line where wall and floor meet is 36 degrees. So this you would just measure on the very surface of the image there and find that at the bottom of that door, that angle is 36 degrees. The physical angle is 90 degrees. So we're rendering a hallway here that's a regular hallway, has a 90-degree angle. The angle experienced in a 3D phenomenally contracted hallway, so you're in the hallway now and you're not just looking at the image, that's about between 80 and 85 degrees. So you have to go be in a real hallway and you're looking at the line between the door jamb and the floor there. And it's about 80 to 85 degrees as measured in a pilot experiment. Accordingly, my 3D contracted space differs from a linear perspective projection. They are as different as 80 and 36. In the contracted space, the floor rises phenomenally but doesn't become a linear perspective projection. That is an instance of what Gibson called the visual field, which he took to be flat, two-dimensional. It belongs to the same geometric family as linear perspective, but it doesn't present a flat perspective image, as does linear perspective. This hall space can be modeled diagrammatically, so slide. Through a top-down view on a perceiver P looking down it. Slide, please. We get the slide. There it is. Okay, so you see the perceiver P there at the bottom. The physical hallway is AEFB. 2 different degrees of contraction are shown here. So those are the dotted lines that are filled in there. And this is for illustrative purpose. One can actually see that many contractions are possible. So you can pull the sides of the and the end of the hallway into a contracted space visually just by pulling everything along the lines of sight. Right. Hence, there are 3 phenomenologies to consider. Full phenomenal constancy, in which case the hallway would not contract, which Gibson and some others assert. A contraction with phenomenal convergence in depth, so that's the same in the railway tracks in here. There's a phenomenal convergence, which I and some others accept. And the painter's attitude yielding a 2D image in linear perspective. So the previous image, when you had the hallway rendered in 2D, that would be the 2D image. It's flat and upright and perpendicular to the line of sight. So the second section is called Not Required by Optics. There is no optical reason why things couldn't appear where they are with their true sizes or with full phenomenal constancy. There's no reason why, when we're standing in a real hallway, the floor would not appear to rise. The apparent angle between the door jamb and the floor would be 90 degrees, and there would be no convergence of the walls. Now, it is really hard actually to imagine that, but that's what full phenomenal constancy requires. The same is true of the train tracks. Although they converge on the retina, that is the image projected on the retina, that does not entail that they converge phenomenally. If size constancy were perfect, the tracks would appear parallel. This point undermines a response to the convergence recently made by contemporary naive direct realists such as Alvin Noe and Bill Brewer. They hold that the convergence results because perception is from a point of view and follows linear perspective. But we've seen that the phenomenal convergence doesn't mirror linear perspective. The railway tracks or hallway, seen from a point of view, need not appear as converging. The convergence is rather a brute phenomenal fact. So it's seen from a point of view, that is, you're seeing the tracks from standing in the middle of them and looking down them. But if they didn't appear to converge, you would still be looking at them from a point of view, right? So point of view doesn't entail linear perspective. It can show effects of linear perspective, but that's not entailed. So the convergence becomes a brute phenomenal fact. All right, section 3, Gibson and the convergence. Nonetheless, when Gibson discussed the train tracks slide in 1950, he treated the convergence as a matter of linear perspective, of accessing what he called the visual field. So there are the train tracks, and if they were in a perspective projection, it would produce the triangle there on the right. So that's just traced off the train tracks on the photograph, and the photograph is a linear perspective rendering when taken as something that's flat on the page, right? He also maintained that size constancy is normal in vision. Slide. In 1966, he wrote concerning the examples of a slanted coin and converging tracks, I have argued that the coin does not always look elliptical and that the tracks do not always seem to converge, surely not to the locomotive engineer. But I do not seem to win this argument, for most people say they do, that is, they do converge, and the results of experiments on shape constancy and size constancy commonly bear them out, end quote. Gibson often wrote as if the only phenomenologies were full constancy or the flat visual field. Accordingly, if things look small in the distance, or a slanted penny looks elliptical, proximal sensations have been forced into experience. Gibson also acknowledged that if perception did not regularly conform to the objective facts of the environment, that was a problem for him. It was a problem if, under full information conditions, there is incomplete perceptual constancy, end quote, as with an elliptical coin or phenomenally converging tracks. For him, these descriptions reflect either poor phenomenology or result from adopting the pictorial attitude. Gibson countered this poor phenomenology by saying that with the penny, it looks like a circle at a slant, so that it looks like a circle. Now, pennies is a little round copper thing for us, whatever coin you like, use that. So, slide. He responded to things looking smaller in the distance by saying that they don't, citing an experiment with stakes in an open field that yielded full constancy out to 0.5 kilometer. So there you can see the stakes, and there are two cases here. So you've got the stake in the very middle of the image, and you're supposed to guess the size of that stake by comparing it to the two ranks of stakes on the side. You can see in the top image, the stake is fairly close. You can see in the bottom image, it's pretty far away. And so then the subjects were evaluating the size of those stakes by picking the nearby one that they matched. And they showed constancy out to more than 0.5 kilometer. All right. So if this means that in ordinary perception, there is no phenomenal diminution at a distance of 1/4 kilometer or even 10 meters, I don't believe it. I'm not saying that things look as if they diminish physically in size and the distance, nor am I denying that visual experience can be altered by the painter's attitude. But I am asserting that normally things diminish phenomenally with distance. Gibson didn't test this, as his experiment used what are called objective instructions in psychophysics. Instructions, quote, to estimate the real height of a stake out there in the field, end quote. He would have understood apparent instructions to describe phenomenal or apparent size, as directing subjects to report a two-dimensional visual field. Finally, Gibson later acknowledged that subjects might have used horizon invariant bisection for the task, but this sort of information survives the contraction, as we'll see in a minute. So you can see that the black line going across there, not quite at the horizon. And so the subjects could look at the proportion of the test object as cut by that black line. And then you can see that they could actually directly match that to the proportions in the standards of comparison. So what makes something a misperception? With the arrows illusion, so slide, we take the difference in line lengths to be non-veridical and hence illusory. But are all deviations from physical reality mistakes? I think Gibson's physicalist objectivism led him to think so. So he takes him taking physical properties as the standard of success. One might expect that Gibson's well-known distinction between ordinary physics and ecological physics would allow him to reconsider the task of spatial perception and to question the idea that the visual system simply targets physically objective properties. His new approach embraced many ecological facts, such as the scale of the environment in question in relation to the organism, the habitat range of the organism in the layout, standing features of illumination and of surfaces. So for instance, that the light comes from above and that surfaces are comparatively continuous, and expanses of earth as a supportive substratum for land animals. Such factors illustrate the doctrine of an organism-environment mutuality. This doctrine describes organism-environment relations in useful ways, including organism-relative functional structures such as shelters and paths. Nonetheless, Gibson privileged physical measurements and descriptions. While offering a variety of ecologically relevant units, he contended that at the relevant scale, the organism responds to and perceives physically objective sizes and shapes and other properties of the layout. Gibson thus retained his 1966 notion that the objective is constituted by ordinary physical properties, declaring that he was investigating sensory systems, quote, by which an organism can take account of its environment and cope with objective facts, end quote. The standard for normal spatial vision is, quote, the perception of the true layout, end quote. In the defining discussion of organism-environment mutuality in 1979, one primary difference between the animal environment and the physical environment concerns the scale of the animal. While physics focuses on atomic and galactic scales, ecological psychology uses millimeters and meters. By retaining in 1979 a physically accurate match or full constancy as the standard of successful size perception, Gibson did not escalate, as he might have, the naive realist preference, as he might have, the naive realist preference for an objective physical world that simply is revealed in perceptions. His organism relative approach should have allowed him to reject metric size measures in favor of relational spatial information. And here I cite Bill Warren, a Gibsonian at Brown, who actually thinks that the ecological approach should go in this direction of relational spatial information rather than absolute metrics. Current naive realism cannot save Gibson because it can't explain why the tracks appear to converge. His recognition of only two phenomenologies, a perspective projection and full physical constancy, led him to conclude that ordinary perception presents the metric structure of the physical world itself. So the concluding section, spatial information under contraction, slide. Consider this diagram again on the relation of visual space to physical space. Many properties of physical space are represented in visual space, even though distance and so size is compressed. So phenomenal direction is congruent with physical direction. Next-to-ness relations on the surface are preserved. The order of interconnectedness remains. Ordinal relations along the ground plane are preserved. Objects retain invariant proportional size even as they contract in phenomenal size. Slide. Because proportions are preserved in the contraction, the horizon invariant ratio as a source of information for absolute size remains intact. Similarly, the relative size information provided by ground texture occlusion is preserved by way of proportion. So you can see this on the left and right side. So if you take that to be not a drawing on the surface on the left there, and you take it not to be showing full phenomenal constancy where everything would look to have their true size, then this is showing the intermediate phenomenology where things go away in space but begin to contract. And under those conditions, you still have the proportional cutting of the telephone poles in a way that gives you information about objective size in relation to your own eye level. And similarly with the optical texture on the right side. These proportional relationships provide information about the spatial layout, even if metric size and distance are compressed. The convergence is just the visual system's way of presenting spatial structure. The contraction of space need not be viewed as a misperception, so the railroad tracks at the beginning need not be seen as a misperception, and may indeed help refine our understanding of organism-environment mutuality. Indeed, if the visual system aimed for full phenomenal constancy, then with increasing distance, it would need to construct like phenomenal units of surface using an ever-diminishing amount of information. Here is a problem that contracted space alleviates in a manner congenial to ecological psychology.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Hatfield. So we have a couple of questions now. I'm going to present the questions according to the order of presentation of the speakers, right? So there are two questions to Roberto, and they were raised by Professor Ivan Ferreira da Cunha. And here goes as follows. Professor Ivan said, if we consider life on Venus to be just a hypothesis, then you're reconstructing the context of a hypothesis and figuring out its confirmation conditions. Why is that a thought experiment to be reconstructable as an argument? Perhaps I'm missing the counterfactual character. So Roberto, the microphone is yours.
Well, Ivan, thank you very much for your questions. Feel free to give me a feedback if I don't answer the questions good enough. So about the first one, if we consider life on Venus to be just a hypothesis, so I'm gonna ask you, is this something else? Like we haven't yet proved that life exists on Venus. So if that's not an hypothesis, so what it is? And you are asking the context of an hypothesis and figuring out its confirmation conditions. So one of the roles that we could attribute to thought experiments could be exactly this, to trying to figure out what reality is like. So I don't see an actual problem saying that some kind of thought experiments does exactly that. And about your second question, why is that thought experiment to be reconstructable as an argument? So my idea was to bring a case that could fit in the colloquium. So I thought that the life on Venus case was a good one to try to bring thought experiments into the discussion. And so when you are asking about the counterfactual character, I'm just gonna say that Norton isn't clear about what he means about the difference between hypothetical and counterfactual. So I think that both for him and maybe for me as well, they mean exactly the same thing. It means something that is not happening now. It's against the actual. So when we are talking about hypothetical or counterfactual thought experiments, we are talking about things that could happen in the future, and maybe trying to figure out what would happen in the future. So I think that's it. I don't know if I answered your questions properly, so feel free to give me some feedback.
All right, thank you very much, Roberto. If anyone wants to raise more questions on the chat, feel free to do that. Okay, now we have a couple of questions to Iago. The first one was raised by Professor Roberta Pires de Oliveira, and she asked, what's the concept of assertion that's being discussed? And there is a second question made by Professor Jerzy Bzozowski, who says, what about lies told within the fictional context? Example, lies told by the characters in a work of fiction.
Okay, thank you for the question. First, I want to say that it was really hard presenting, looking to no one, looking just to my computer. It was confusing. Now I'm gonna answer the questions. First, for Roberta, I'm using the speaker meaning definition of assertion, just as Grice intended. Like it is, assertion is the expression of a belief and the expression of the intention that the belief was raised by the audience also. The same belief and the same content. That's a non-problematic characterization. Actually, that's a problematic characterization because you have to go way deeper if you want to solve the problems that Grice wanted to solve, or the problems with Grice's conception. But I'm using this because the usual conception of fiction making is constructed on Gricean basis, like Curry, Friend, Davis, Stock, everyone constructs fiction making in terms of make-believe and in relation to belief, like Grice's conception of assertion. So that's my conception of assertion. So now for Jerzy. Jerzy asked it, what did Jerzy ask? About fictions within, lies within fiction. So actually, Jerzy answered his own question, because what I'm discussing is speech text made by the author of a work of fiction. And what Jerzy said, it was a lie told by a character, not by the author. So that I wanted to delve more in this topic. Actually, I wanted to talk about this because that's what I'm researching now. The difference, I'm trying to propose a strict and clear-cut distinction between the author of a narrative and the narrative itself. So the author never, it's never inside the narrative. And I'm trying to do this on Stalnakian dynamic models and blah, blah, blah. This doesn't come true. So the speech act, the lie, was not told by the author of a fictional work. It was told either by the narrator of the fictional work or a character inside the fiction. So that's my point. The author never lies, because the author never asserts also. The author just fiction makes. And he fiction makes a character, be it like Sherlock Holmes, a character, actual character. So the character asserts something, not the author. The author fiction makes that the character asserts something, or the author fiction makes that the narrator, someone who's conducting the story, like the narrator of Ana Karenina, he fiction makes that the narrator of the story is asserting something or lying or something else. So there can be assertions in fiction in some sense, but the assertions are never made by the author. They are made by the characters, be it an actual character or the narrator of the fiction. That's my answer. I don't know if I believe it answered, because actually Jerzy answered himself the question.
Okay, thank you very much, Iago. Now there are some questions to Professor Hatfield, and they were raised by Professor Ivan Ferreira da Cunha. Actually, it was one question, not two questions, so let's stick with that. So Professor Ivan says, do you think this divergence between perceived and projected space could pose a problem to those trying to produce immersive reality tech? I mean, assuming Gibson's right, which I think he is, we wouldn't seem to mistake perception and projection. Ultimately, we'd have a way for telling we're not brains in a vat. So Professor Hatfield, the microphone is yours.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. Properties of projective geometry are sort of counterintuitive, I think, after you get out of the two cases of the objective world and its projection onto a plane. So I don't have its projection onto a plane. I have its projection, a 3D to 3D projection with a compressive factor. Now I'd say, well, is there any evidence for that this kind of thing goes on in perception other than your own phenomenology and a few of these experiments that I could have cited but didn't? Well, there was a guy over here at Drexel who was trying to make a mirror that you would look in and then the things you saw in the mirror, so like a rear view mirror for a car, and the things you saw behind you would be in their true size, not as it is now. So, there's the warning, things in the mirror may seem smaller than they really are and may seem further away than they really are. And so on his website, there was always the note, still working on this case. And I think what he discovered, I haven't talked to him about this, but I think what he discovered is that there's no way to say how much convergence is needed, and so how much anti-convergence would be needed to get a mirror image that didn't diminish at all with distance. There's no geometrical fact that tells you that. It's an empirical fact about our subject-dependent compression of space, right? So after the pandemic is over, I'll hope to have a beer with this guy and see if my conjecture is true. And this is also true for virtual reality producers. So when you make virtual reality, you always have to put a compression factor in there, right? And so the colleague I mentioned at Brown, Bill Warren, he would play around with that compression factor. And he would find that people didn't actually notice when you increased or decreased it. So that would mean that the railroad tracks would increase or decrease in convergence, depending on what you feed into your virtual reality system. So the brain in the vat thing, yeah, so you could say, well, if you move around in an environment, things shift in lawful ways, and those are also proportional to distance. And so there, Gibson and I agree. What we disagree on is what the resulting perception should be. Should it be show full constancy, or should it have a contraction factor? And I say it should have a contraction factor. So each of us can accept this idea that bodily motion through an environment gives you proportional information about distances, like in those telephone poles in one of my slides. Whether the mad scientists who are running the brain in the vat computer couldn't just replicate this experience, I've always sort of thought they could. That's why I think the brain in the vat is really hard to refute. I mean, even with Hilary Putnam's refutation, you have to accept a very recherche theory, much more hard to believe than the brain in the vat hypothesis about reference in order to think that you've got a refutation there. So in any case, I hope that I've addressed Ivan's questions adequately.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Hatfield. So we have a couple of questions for Iago right now. Professor Hatfield asks, what if we had biographical evidence such as a letter from Tolstoy? And there is also a follow-up from Professor Gerzi, who says, my point to Iago would be that the way we detect speakers, characters, intentions in fiction may be very different from the cues that we pick up in real life, so that one must learn how to understand that a certain character is lying in very different ways from what we would use to detect that a person, including the author of the fiction, is lying. And wouldn't an unreliable narrator be a case of the author lying? So 2 questions for Iago. The microphone is yours.
Okay, Ítalo, can you please paste the question, Jersey's question here for me so I can grasp it in full content, please? Thank you. So first, Professor Hatfield's question. Actually, it's a really interesting case because even if we had actual evidence that that Tolstoy believed what he wrote, I don't think it should be ground to take it as a question, because we can never be sure that if this evidence actually is, if this evidence is actually true, or if it holds or something like that. And his communicative intention inside the work of fiction would still be covert. So it will not be overt for assertion, because someone could never know that this letter existed, so it could never be common ground that he actually believed that, and things like that. So it will not be an assertion, it will still be an act of fiction making. But we can still believe it. We can still construct our beliefs on basis of acts of fiction making. I just don't think it should be assertions. We can still acquire belief, and we can still believe what the author wrote, and we can still know that it was believed by the part of the author, but it isn't an assertion, because we can never be sure that it's a sincere assertion, and there are no insincere assertions, so we can never be sure of the author's communicative intentions. That's my point. So even if we have evidence, this evidence does not bring certainty to the communicative intention. That's my response. Okay, so now Jersey. Yes, but there's 2 important points about characters and how we recognize speech acts from characters. Actually, I believe it's a pretty similar way which we recognize communicative intention from characters, in which we recognize communicative intention from real life people or real life persons, or I don't know. The point is, we recognize them based on sentential structure, usually. Not always. Sentential structure do not fix a speech act, but it's the best clue we have. If it's in a declarative mood, if it is on all those things that we associate with assertion, we will take it to be an assertion. But it is important to understand how fictional characters perform speech acts. This is not a topic that I could delve here, because it involves a little bit of formalism, and I had to take this formalism out so I could be in time for my presentation. But the point is, the character does not really perform the speech act. He actually, we imagines that he's performing the speech act, so we can misimagine, we can imagine in a way that's not actually as the author wanted us to imagine. So this we will be misimaginating the act that the character did, but he didn't actually did, because he doesn't exist. He's just a character. We are imagining that he did. And we are actually, this is a failure to recognize how the author wanted us to imagine. So we will be misimagining what the author, misunderstanding the speech act made by the author. You can think of the speech act made by the author as a quotation. When you read a quotation, you do not take it to be an assertion or or an utterance made by who's making the quotation. You take it to be by someone other. And you recognize the speech act that this someone else is making. Like when you read the quotation that I put from Stacy Friend, you take that Stacy Friend asserted it. Not me, not Iago. Iago didn't assert it. I'm quoting Stacy Friend, who actually asserted that thing. So in the case of the author, he's telling you to imagine that someone else, like the narrator or the character, did such and such. Now about unreliable narrator, the distinction between the author and the narrator are broadly accepted in literary studies. Like, it's a mistake to take the author to be the same person as the narrator. Usually, I take it to need a little bit of justification, but usually this is taken for granted. You don't take Dom Casmurro and Machado de Assis to be the same person. You know that Machado de Assis is representing someone, Dom Casmurro, as narrating what he's actually narrating. And you don't take also Tolstoy to be speaking as the narrator of Anna Karenina. You take to be a figure distinct from Tolstoy, which you can construct a distinct set of beliefs. You can propose a lot of things for the narrator of Anna Karenina that are not from Tolstoy. This is a common distinction in literary studies, the distinction between the narrator and the author. And unreliable narrator is not a feature of the author, it's a feature of the narrator. That's why it's a reliable narrator, not a reliable author. The author is still reliable. You can believe that the author wrote what he wrote, but you can believe that the narrator is narrating the facts as they happen in the story. That's my response. I hope it was clear.
That's it. Thank you very much. We don't have other questions, so I would like to thank Roberto, Iago, and Professor Hatfield for being here. It was an excellent experience. Actually, we do have, hold on, we have a question from Professor Hatfield for Iago. It's a late call, but we still have time, it's all right. So Professor Hatfield says, what about historical fiction? Shelby Foote and his stories of characters in actual battles, etc. So here we go.
This is a good one, which I don't know how to answer, actually. I have some clues how to answer, and I'm going to provide a worse example, worse for me. Like when someone is proposing a thought experiment, for example, or when someone is telling a counterfactual story about some, I don't know, the consequences of a certain war in a paper, in a journal article, like in the New York Times or something like that. This seems to involve imagination. In the same case as fiction making involves imagination. This is worse because corner cases are always problematic. What I think is that in those cases, it's a dual act. But in those cases, I'm not sure if we could actually classify as a clear-cut fiction as like Anna Karenina or Dom Casmurro or, I don't know, 100 Years of Solitude or something like that. Corner cases will be harder, and maybe in corner cases, there are assertions, there are dual acts. But I don't know if I don't really know how to answer this. Actually, this is what is delaying the paper about it, because I feel like I have to tackle this question, but I have no idea what to defend. I'm inclined to say that it is a dual act. I'm inclined to say like it's something like Caitlin Stock proposed, but I don't know.
All right, excellent. Actually, we have one more question. I was about to commit a sin to finish our session with questions remaining, so here we go. There is another question from Professor Ivan to Professor Hatfield, and Professor Ivan says, so just to make clear, you disagree with Gibson that objectivity comes from the physical?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that I disagree. So it depends on objectivity for what type of representation? I mean, Gibson doesn't like the notion of representation, but it's easier to talk that way. So if we're asking, is it an objective fact that a certain room is 4 meters across, right? I say that in vision, if you're standing at one end of the room, there'll be a contraction, and what looks to be 4 meters close to you will have a different appearance farther from you, and it'll be contracted. But there's also the question of what's the objective fact about the shape of the room, and you can take a tape measure or a ruler, and you can measure out. And for that, the contraction doesn't matter because you're just lining up lines and then reading off of a scale. Sometimes it's good to compare the spatial case with color vision. So we see things as red, yellow, blue, green, all sorts of colors, right? One way of reading modern science is that it's told us that it doesn't have those colors in the naive realist sense that they're just properties of the surface. So then another group of realists, the physical subjectivist realists, say, well, then what color really is the surface spectral reflectance. It's a physical property. And the fact that we don't see as many colors as there are different surface reflectances just shows that all of our color vision contains many errors and failures to perceive. And so I say, well, no, what is color vision about? It's about telling things apart. And to tell things apart, you don't need to actually extract this arcane physical property called a surface spectral reflectance. They just have to look different in reliable ways under lots of illuminations. So what's the purpose of spatial vision? Well, it's to be able to navigate and go where you are. For that purpose, you do need visual direction, or it's better if visual direction is preserved. So Gibson and I both would agree that visual direction, a physical property, is, I would say, represented. He would say perceived. But then he wants to go on and say that in order for perception to be correct, it has to get the metric structure. So that to me is like saying that in order for color vision to be correct, it has to get the actual surface spectral reflectance, this physical property, because we don't have the idea of any other kind of property match that might help. So I want to say effectiveness in guiding navigation. That's the kind of property that we need, and that for that, proportions are okay. Now, proportions are also, in a sense, physical, but these are going to be organism relative proportions. So they wouldn't be studied in physics, they would be studied in ecological psychology. So in ecological psychology, we can have a mixture of matching physical objectivity with a mixture of matching proportions that respond to physical objectivity. And Gibson liked proportions, but for this shape and size kind of situation, he didn't hit on the idea of using proportions instead of, so he used the proportions for information, but the information was supposed to then be about the true metric structure. And he might have been better off if he thought that you get the information and it gives you in perception proportions, from which you can then, if you need to know the actual size of the room, you can measure it, or you can get good at estimating from the way it appears with a certain contraction. So thank you, Yvonne, for all of these questions, which are very interesting.
Thank you very much, Professor Hatfield. So any more questions? I'm gonna take a look on the YouTube chat to see if something's up. Well, it looks like there are no questions remaining. So now I would like to thank again Roberto, Iago, Professor Hatfield for being here. It was a pleasure. It was an excellent session. And I want to say goodbye to everyone. Stay healthy, use masks, stay at home if you can. And as soon as the pandemic is over, we shall meet again and have a good time. All right? So that's it. Thank you very much. Have an awesome day, everyone.